What I want to really talk about here is something I've been meaning to talk about for a while, so I might as well out and make a video about it, is just something relating to the WWE. Now, something that I find WWE gets criticism of a lot is the quality of the matches are not overall not good enough, and also that the storylines are either there's too much focus on some of them, and also they can be too silly. Now, here's something that I really need to point out, because that's not even really what this video is about, just kind of a segue to get in there. If you're watching WWE, whether you are a supporter of WWE or not, one thing that you need to be sure you're doing is that you're watching the full scope of WWE. At one time, that would mean watching Raw. However, that being said, WWE is not only Raw at this point in time. WWE has expanded over such a period of time, quite a while now, that SmackDown, what was originally just a supplement to WWE programming, the B show, if you will, is now actually an integral part of WWE, and it is almost essential to WWE's existence. I'm pretty sure the ratings on SmackDown and the overall viewership is not as high, and people are more reluctant to talk about it. However, and also WWE even doesn't put as much emphasis or focus on it. However, it really is essential to WWE right now. There are two major parts. Also, there's ECW now. Is a pretty new brand. I'm going to talk about that maybe just a little bit later on. But that's it. In general, there are two major aspects of WWE. Raw and SmackDown, which really need each other to exist. You can't have one without the other. Now, one thing that you'll find with Raw is that they place a very large emphasis on storyline and such. Not only do you have the storylines focused on a lot more, and you probably have more of them, you also have just a lot more interview segments, a lot more backstage segments, a lot more promos, a lot more time spent on the microphone with people in general than you do in any other part of WWE. This is almost entirely what defines Raw as a show. Hornswoggle's on Raw. You have that whole storyline involving him, Jonathan Coachman. That doesn't even have anything to do with wrestling at all. You still see that a lot. And overall, that is what dominates on Raw. And they do put a lot of emphasis into storylines. That being said, Raw is not the sum total of WWE, and Raw's matches are probably, I think, the worst on WWE television programming at the moment. This is why you have SmackDown. SmackDown exists almost to counter the lack of wrestling on Raw. SmackDown puts on, not only do they almost always have more matches than Raw, but they always put on at least a handful of really just solid matches, good matches, on pretty much a weekly basis. However, that being said, I'm not going to say that you could have only SmackDown. I'm not even saying that Raw should be more like SmackDown. That being said, again, they need each other to exist. But SmackDown really, as far as just a wrestling show is concerned, as far as wrestling is concerned, SmackDown is better. Look at certain things. First off, SmackDown usually starts, it hasn't this past few weeks, but it usually starts off with at least a match. You don't have that on Raw. Very rarely, and when you do have a match opening the show, it's usually a match, it's usually a diva match involving divas from all of the brands in some sort of gimmick match. I'm telling you, almost always when they open with a match, that's what it is. And that's because it's like some special event or holiday or whatever. Also, in general, SmackDown puts on better matches. Here's something you really need to watch out for on SmackDown. SmackDown has actually interesting how layered it is, because it has a very solid mid-card section that almost dominates the show, almost carries the show. Now, that's interesting because the main event wrestlers, because their matches are hyped so much, and because whenever you have a feud there, everyone's looking forward to seeing them going at it at the next pay-per-view, their matches are very limited. However, in the mid-card area, you don't have that same restriction, and you do usually have SmackDown will almost every week, put on a moderate length, very good match at around 40 minutes into the show. So between like 40 minutes into the show and the first hour, you have generally in that time period a very good match. And that's because you have wrestlers like MVP, Finlay, Matt Hardy, Rey Mysterio, I guess. These are the major mid-card guys on SmackDown, and they really are able to, when they get in the ring with each other, put on very good shows. I know Matt Hardy hasn't been on for a while, but still, they're very good. And even when you don't have these guys, they also, in the past, they would have other things. Back when Paul London and Brian Kendrick were on SmackDown, and they were tag team champions, even though they didn't defend their titles every week, they were still wrestling every week. Literally every week around that point in time that I described, they would have a tag team match, and it would be a competitive, moderate length match. And that's something that, even though Raw right now has the bigger tag team division, that's something you don't see on Raw. I think the champions now are actually Hardcore Holly and Cody Rhodes, which is interesting. But you really don't see that as much. You don't see any of the tag teams on Raw right now in action as much as you used to when London and Kendrick were champions. Right now, the tag titles on SmackDown are on ECW, so that's... And even then, even now that the tag titles are on ECW, every week you see The Miz and John Morrison in tag action, because I actually think ECW isn't really its own brand so much as it is an extension of SmackDown. That's pretty much what they're using it for. And even then, you still have that. Overall on Raw, you have very few matches, because here's how it works out. Here's the general format on Raw. You usually open the show with some kind of a 20-minute segment that takes like the first 20 minutes. Then the first wrestling match on the card is usually a Divas match. And what sucks about that is that rather than having... Okay, I'll admit the women wrestlers on Raw in WWE right now aren't that great, but even so, it's usually either a big tag team match that's over in 3 minutes, or it's Beth Phoenix squashing someone. Santino Marella comes out at some point and talks for a very long segment. You've got more interviews backstage. In general, also, it seems that nobody in the mid-card section of Raw really gets that time in the ring, unless you're Jeff Hardy. And if you're Jeff Hardy, then not only are you being pushed to bigger main event type status, but also your matches are repetitive and you usually win. So there you have it. You really don't have the same competitiveness of the matches, and the matches are generally... It's very rare that I'll see a match on Raw that lasts more than 5 minutes as far as airtime is concerned. Whereas SmackDown, not only are their matches good, but I would say that some of the best matches I've seen in WWE have been on SmackDown. Also ECW, I'm just going to talk about that really quickly. They have overall been acting I think this is also pretty good. They're not really a separate brand right now so much as they are a logical extension of SmackDown, because they've been having, again, the talent exchange. There's been virtually passing back and forth. Almost every match on ECW now involves someone from SmackDown. And I think that's actually a very good way of doing things. Also, there are like there are generally, I think, 4 matches on ECW. I'd say 2 of them are just like really quick squash type matches. The other 2 are generally really good. If you've been seeing The Miz and John Morrison versus Jimmy Wang Yang and Shannon Moore these past 2 weeks, they have been really good matches for WWE television. Also, one thing I will say, this is just actually not even so much credit to SmackDown as it is to MVP. MVP versus CM Punk on ECW this past week, the date being the 18th? Was that December 18th? I'm not sure. It started off, if it continued for another like 15 minutes, that would have been a phenomenal match. I'm serious. But again, and more credit to them, WWE relies on SmackDown to put on the really good matches, the really entertaining, competitive matches, in such a way that they can support Raw and they can have 2 hours of basically backstagery. So if you are watching WWE, if you're a WWE fan, or even if you're a critic of WWE, you should be watching SmackDown, because SmackDown really is the wrestling show of WWE. That is, again, as I've said, Raw you still need, but you generally SmackDown, overall the matches, I'd have to say the better show. And I'll get more into the different aspects of this at a later time. That's about it for now. According to my counter, I've been talking for far too long, so I guess I'll have to edit this down. And goodbye and Merry Christmas, I suppose. Thank you, and good night.